Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Namaskar and good morning to all joining us today from New Delhi and different parts of India and the globe. I am Manish Dabhade here, and I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of the Indian Futures. I take this opportunity to welcome you all today on behalf of the Indian Futures. I cannot but begin by hoping that you and your loved ones are safe and healthy. Let me at the outset, as I always do, introduce the Indian Futures very briefly. I'm sure all the participants would know this, but for the benefit of our speaker today, ma'am, we are a New Delhi-based independent media organization that started out way back in January 2016 with the sole aim to creating a global platform to plainly and dispassionately discuss in the truest ancient Indian tradition of a samvad, a dialogue, the ideas of new India in all the varied dimensions and contestations. The idea is to go beyond the headlines of the day and have a honest, deep dive conversation amongst the thinking community in India and abroad. The idea is to organize, probe, stimulate, and at times provoke the innermost mind on a contemporary theme of relevance to India and the world. We are extremely proud to have hosted some of India's finest minds from the world of government, politics, academia, diplomacy, and culture. Dr. Vinay Sahasrabudhe, President ICCR, Sri Devendra Fadnavis, former Chief Minister of Maharashtra, Sri Sunil Ambekar ji, Sri J. Nandakumar ji, Sri S. Gurumurthy ji, BJP General Secretaries, Sri B.L. Santosh ji, Muralidhar Rao ji, Saroj Pandey ji, and of course, Ram Madhav ji. Then also, we have similarly hosted Ambassador P.S. Raghavan, who is chairman of the National Security Advisory Board now, Ambassador Vijay Gokhale, who recently retired as the Foreign Secretary of India, and most prominently our own JNU academic, Professor Makarand Paranjpe, who is the director of IIS Shimla. I'm sure all of you would know that. And these are just a few I've mentioned here. I'm very happy that we have also started our own Maharashtra chapter, since I'm from Maharashtra, with the series called Sahyadri Samvad, which is a flagship lecture series in Marathi. Let me again, for the benefit of the distinguished guest today, also talk about the whole idea of our autumn workshop on Indian governance and politics and Modi effect that began Monday. If one carefully passes through the dominant narratives and the so-called discourses on contemporary politics and governance in media and the academia, but especially since 2014, one can singularly flag many times the blatant partisan nature of assessing the very critical nature of fundamental changes coupled with very transformational reforms that have marked the Modi government since 2014. This elite narrative many times stands in sharp contradiction to the mass narratives that have wholeheartedly backed Modi government elections after elections, most spectacularly, obviously, in May 2019, with an improved majority for the BJP on its own at 303 seats. This workshop, as you would all notice, has brought India's best and brightest minds to take a fresh, honest, a very scholarly look at the Modi government record, their dasha and disha, their state of play now, and their trajectory. We have marked at least 10 themes that deserve more scrutiny and analyses. For example, Atmanirbhar Bharat, Prime Minister's office, and we had Shakti Sinha speaking on that beautifully, covering the entire period from 47 till the present times. Today we have national education policy, and especially Indian knowledge systems. And then we have sessions on e-governance, Modi revolution, and federalism. Yesterday evening we had by CPR head Ms. Yamini Iyer, and then changing party system. And obviously, when you talk about changing party system, it's actually moving from the Congress system to the BJP system. I personally enjoyed the lectures which you held earlier, and I'm looking forward to hearing them all today and even later. We are extremely delighted and privileged to have Professor Sunaina Singh, India's top and very dynamic academic and educational institutional leader, with us today. Professor Singh is the Vice Chancellor of Nalanda University, an internationally acclaimed historical university with the MEA located in Rajgir, and she's right now in Rajgir, Bihar. Professor Singh is currently engaged with a very onerous task of rebuilding the renowned ancient Nalanda University. The honor of re-establishing a university has been entrusted to her largely because of her compelling leadership. She is among the most prominent leaders in higher education in the South Asian region, a distinguished academician and administrator. She is also the vice president of ICCR, a very significant position, additional assignment she has been holding. She is member of Governing Council, Association of Indian Universities. She is member board of trustee India Foundation, a very prominent think tank in the country now, amongst many other positions she holds. She has been honored with many, many awards, and I'll just mention a couple of them. Some noteworthy ones include International Education Award 2018, which was awarded in British Parliament, House of Lords, London. Bharat Ratna, Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam Excellence Award in 2018 by IIFS. Bharat Shiksha Ratna Award 2018, Education Leadership Award, you name it. I mean, all the top awards, she is really has been getting it by the sheer power of her hard work, by the power of her brilliance, by her academic leadership. It's truly an honor, ma'am, that you have found time to join with us and really speak to us on a very important topic, national education policy, because it has come, this is only the third policy which has been announced since 1947. So we all are looking forward to your masterclass, and I'm personally looking to learn about how what sort of ideas are really animating, what sort of ideas has really animated and brought the national education policy in place, including the Indian knowledge systems. How can we actually benefit? I mean, I'm sure that is such a ignored area. So I think it's very important that we are having this session. So with this, I warmly welcome Professor Sunaina Singh to the workshop today, and we're looking forward to you. Over to you, ma'am. Thank you.
Namaskar. Good morning to all of you. Thank you, Manish. Thank you very much. I think without much ado, I think we should start our master class as it has been put. Well, higher education in India. I think what is most appealing about the new education policy 2020 is that we have finally been the pragmatism that has been dominating the Indian scene for a number of decades since our independence. Finally, I think we have been able to redraft our education policy. The trajectory has been not very interesting, but it has had its journey. 1968, 1986, 1992, a few changes into modifications into the policy of education drafted earlier. Finally, we have this very inspiring document, National Education Policy. If we are able to succeed in implementing it, I think India will surpass all education systems in the world. Let me start with that point. Now, why is it that systems change? How is it that we need to move forward in Indian education system? James Joyce, a very well-known writer, had once said that any theory, any thought, any philosophy, any school of thought is like a wick of lamp. When it smokes, we need to trim it. When it smokes too heavily, we need to change the wick. I think the national education policy, India, for the first time, we have changed the entire wick. We have stopped with trimming processes. That is done with. Now we have a new wick. How do we propose to keep the lamp shining all the time? That's something that we need to pause it upon. When we look at the education scenario, I think what we mean by it is the knowledge landscape. What is our knowledge landscape? Have the universities or institutions been able to reinvent themselves periodically is something that we need to think about. And probably, one might say, depending on the leadership, some institutions may have made a few trimmings, a few modifications. I would like to stick to the word trimmings and not go beyond that. But we have not been able we have not succeeded in reinventing ourselves completely. It has always been recarpeting, a kind of, trying to improvise or probably further re-energize the Machiavellian theories. That's all that has been done so far, or in the initial periods of our independence. Now let's look at the education system that's been proposed to be reconfigured. It's very important that we look at the critical targets that the new education policy has set for itself. It says 2030 we should be able to embark on the new education policy. By 2040 we should have succeeded in covering a whole lot of areas in the education policy, and hopefully we will. Much would depend on leadership, much would depend on regulatory mechanisms, much would depend on the support system coming from the government, or shall I say, it depends mostly on the autonomy given to the institutions. For me, this is the most important thing, because once the autonomy is given, I think the institutions and the faculty primarily should focus on how do we order and shape what we see around us. Because education, the fundamental principle of education is to achieve a full human potential. What exactly are we aiming at? One, a student or the next generation have acquired or realized a full potential. They believe in themselves, that they are talented, they have the intelligence, they have the humane concerns, they are compassionate, they are driven by their ambition, they are enthusiastic. All this backed with scholarship, backed with knowledge. Now, once that is, we are able to give this to our youngsters, I think they can conquer the world. That confidence is something that one needs to give to our students. So achieving full human potential, I think, is in an equitable world, in a just society, promoting national development, because India has. That's why I said national education policy. When I look at education system across the world, and look at our own ancient knowledge systems, I find that the entire world is actually aiming at what India was trying to do ages ago, and that is to realize the self, to prepare a youngster to face the world, the challenges of the world. That is what the ancient education system did. So key to providing quality education then should be envisaged in different ways. It should be a continual ascent in our scholarship. It should be how do you reinvent leadership on a global platform. I'm not saying just Indian platform, because leadership should always look at the wider horizons. If we limit ourselves to just the state or the region or the nation, I think we need to move beyond that, because we are preparing citizens of India as global citizens. So it's very important that scholarship, therefore the domain also expands, because I personally believe that education or institutions need to be expansive. They need to be concepts are very important. We do that with our accounts and finance, but rarely do we look at our courses, rarely do we look at our systems. We, of course, do have, a board of studies that tries to look at syllabus, but that's only tweakings, again, trimmings, I would say. Holistically, we do not change anything. So it's important that we rework every couple of years uh, uh, we rechart again and again. The revisions and the revamping of higher education system. Now, national education policy has four segments to it. One is the school education, just a recap. The second one is the higher education. The third one is the other key areas of focus, the aligned areas. And finally, how do you make it happen? These are the four segments of the NEP. So I'm not going to focus on the first. I'm looking at the higher education and how do we make it happen? Within the parameters of Indian knowledge systems. This is also very important. I believe we need to pause it periodically on that, because if we've had Takshashila and Nalanda, Vallabhi, and other institutions in ancient India, which have been hugely successful, which are still quoted across the world, I think there's some merit there that we need to borrow from. We need to dwell into. I don't think that has been done at all. Why is it that these institutions, because were successful, were they successful because it was a Gurukula system, monastic system of education, which means in today's parlance, mentoring, you have, the teacher-student ratio has to be brought down. In India, it doesn't seem to be happening because given the population and given the younger population, which seem to be I think India has the largest younger population, and it will continue to be for another 10 or 20 years, another 2 decades. So we cannot alter. Can we alter the student-teacher ratio? Not much, I would say, to be very realistic. But still, we can have reinvent our courses in such a way in higher education, undergraduate and postgraduate, is more project-based, which is more debate-based, which is more experiential, which is more cafeteria modeled. So we need to remodel education. We have now a template of NEP, but that's a template. It's for the education leaders, it's for the faculty, it's for the grassroots level workers in the education system to take it higher, because reality ought to be no more than a springboard. NEP should be a springboard for all educationists to take ourselves off to another realm. Now, how do we look at education policy in the 21st century? Should it continue to be the same that it has been for centuries across the world, I'm talking? Or should we look at revisioning and revamping, and if so, in what direction? How is something that we need to ask. What direction and how? These are two important questions that need to be addressed. So let's take a look at some of the examples, which would require, a positive regulation mechanism at the internal level and probably at the external level. A governance structure that is pro-institution, that will only encourage and enthuse, build a support system for the institutional leaders so that there is no hitch in taking very innovative practices forward. We should not be restricted by our classroom mechanism. We need to move beyond that. When we say beyond that, the experiential learning, field trips, probably, service to humanity. There are a lot of factors that we can build into this system. The cafeteria model by itself will allow us to move easily. You know, we need to build new trajectories. I'll come to that. That's the multidisciplinary factor. I'll come to it a little later. So how do we look at what is it that we need to teach in today's time? So for example, I've just drafted 2 or 3 examples, not many that I have in mind. And one is, if you look at the demands of climate change, or increasing population, depleting natural resources, there's a sizable shift that we see in the world's energy, water, food, sanitation needs across the world. They are changing. They are altering at a speed that we are not used to. You know, so we need to take another look at it. What does it demand? It demands skilled employees, skilled youngsters to address the issues. Waste management is one of the major issues that seem to be troubling us. You know, in Nalanda, I'm creating a completely sustainable campus. It's called Net Zero Campus, zero carbon emission. And I find it so difficult because we are stuck in pre-independence, or, those laws where the tenders, things like that, which an academic cannot understand. Lowest bidder, and the quality might be really very bad, but we still need to go with the lowest. So how do you address, when I say waste management, we are looking at water management. We've created 40 hectares of water bodies in the university. You should all travel and see Nalanda, maybe not now after the pandemic. You will see a completely different world emerging out here. So my point here is that we need a completely different skills that we need to provide to the world. Therefore, our education system also needs to. Honorable Prime Minister has spoken about solar ventures, disaster management across the world. 2019, a conglomerate has been created with different countries on board. What are we doing in India? How do we take it forward? Are we doing it for one building? Do we want it for a large section of people? How do we do it for institutions? So that's something. So skilled forces have to be trained in a certain way. That's one example. The other example of how education needs to be relooked in terms of courses and other. So the growing emergence of epidemics and the current pandemic, I think, also calls for collaborative research. This is something that we have been very poor at. Collaborative research across the world, across the universities, across the institutions, and not just international, within India as well. Does an Indian Institute of Science collaborate with an IIT? Does an IIT collaborate with a central university? We don't. We are all trapped in our silos. So that's something we need to conquer. We need to, reset our minds. We need to reset our parameters of research. How do we do? And that's where I was thinking about. See, US has this beautiful mechanism where they look at research nationally. It was Richard Nixon in 1971 who brought in Project Apollo, announced Project Apollo. What was that? The moon expedition. And this was in 1971. No, I'm sorry. What am I saying? Yeah. So Project Apollo. And you find that they have done amazingly well. Then there was this cancer moonshot, outsmarting cancer. How do we do it? Cancer moonshot was done by Nixon, and Kennedy actually spoke in sorry, I got the dates wrong there. 1961, Kennedy actually announced the Apollo project, you know, the moon expedition. And 61 he announced, and the funding was made available to the institutions. There was a massive research program. 1969, you find that the first manned moon landing happened, because the country itself brought in its forces. And when I say forces, I'm talking about the academic forces, the scientists, the researchers to work on it. Ample funding was provided. Research laboratories with state-of-the-art equipment was provided so that the researchers could work. Within a decade, you find that they were able to do that. You know, same thing with we call it cancer moonshot. That's outsmarting cancer. That's how. So where is this moonshot research in India? We don't have anything of that kind. Leave alone the nation. We don't have it at the institutional level. We leave it to the faculty. I'll tell you how it works, because I sit in a vice chancellor's chair. We demand and expect our faculty to do massive research, to write their articles, to write their books, but we do not provide the infrastructure. We do not encourage. We just expect that they would have done something and come for the interview for promotions, you know. And these are research at individual levels. These are not, you know, the university is not saying that this university will focus on this area or this particular area, and we will keep changing the areas every 5 years. We'll have another moonshot research. We'll have another moonshot research. And the findings go to the government as policy changes, you know. If we can do that, I think then NEP would be successful. So I look at it that way. The second, apart from epidemics and the climate science that needs to work, I've spoken about that. The third important and I think very relevant area that's been disturbing the entire planet, I would say, is the growing terrorism. You know, the affinity towards violence, the indifference, the gender crimes, the general apathy and the lack of sensitiveness, compassion, growing mental health issues. Now, you know, what we find is absence of simplicity, absence of peace, absence of holistic character building, you know, where a man, if we are able to provide education to the entire populace, and the education at school level begins with compassion, begins with simplicity, you know, begins with tolerance, I think then we would have conquered, we would have created. Because if you look at psychology and science, they say that the first 10 years of their life, the children learn the maximum, you know. The intellect is at its sharpest. So we need to give that to our children. We don't have a strong foundation. We cannot build an edifice of knowledge over a weak foundation. It's bound to crumble, you know. While we continue to make efforts to develop and evolve the human character, but unless, you know, the world should look at India and take examples from us, which used to happen earlier. You know, it should be that. And a Gandhi and a Vivekananda transformed the way the world perceived India, you know. So it's something like that. We cannot have a, you know, once in a millennia individual. I think we need to have more people, and we need to prepare young minds in that direction. So this is something that is again a problem. You know, Emerson and Thoreau were called American Brahmins because they had studied our scriptures, Upanishads, Vedas. They had immense faith in Indian knowledge systems, you know. They were called American Brahmins. And one of the things that Emerson said, uh, and I think this has something to do with the Indian knowledge systems. He said Indian knowledge systems prepare a complete holistic individual, kind of a thing. And he said this was in the 20th century, remember, where the American dream, the world wars, things like that. But I don't think we have gone too far away. We've succeeded in many, many directions, but the human nature and the human character has been dipping, you know. We are moving backwards rather than forward. Where, so he said the reason why the world lacks unity and lies broken and in heaps is because man is disunited with himself. So what we have is a splintered, fragmented man. Unless we are able to make a complete persona, you know, an individual who's well-rounded in many, many ways. I think that is what our education system needs to give, right from primary to the top level. These were the examples. So I thought that we need to look at how do we prepare. Now I was reading some time back, of course, after coming here and sitting in vice chancellor's chair is very difficult to follow your scholarship. You know, you miss your books, you miss your teaching, you miss your classroom. I'm very happy to be with all of you. While I cannot see the faces, I like to look at the faces. I like to see who I'm talking to, because it's a very palpable interaction that we have. It's a dynamic process being in the classroom. I hope the pandemic is little kind to all of us so that we can get back into our classrooms. And I think administrators have little more time to pursue their scholarly ambitions too. I was reading, there's a very interesting book called The Excellent Sheep. This is written by William Deresiewicz. Now, William Deresiewicz studied in the top schools, you know, Yale, Harvard, Stanford. He's been everywhere, and he was teaching in Yale. And after 10 years, he gave it all up to be a writer. Because he said that he was very disillusioned with this elite education system, you know, where it's just the credit drubbing and improving on your biodata, how students seem to be, he called it a duck syndrome, because on the surface you seem to be cruising very well because they all have corporate jobs or they're aiming at corporate jobs. Salaries are important. Where you land is very important. So people are looking at that. But, beneath the surface, they're struggling because somewhere they're dissatisfied with themselves. There's a lack of moral courage or passionate purpose, or a generation that's just trying to be very polite often, or should I put it, trying to be very, very cultured on the surface. But actually, they are, if you take a closer look, they are praise addicted, they are great grubbing, actually non-entities within themselves, because they have not been able to build a self. They build a career for themselves. All right. They're making good money. That's fine. But somewhere there's dissatisfaction within, because they have not been able to build a self. You know, building a self is so important. This is what we call Atmanavidhi, you know, self-realization. Our entire Indian knowledge system is about self-realization. How do we build a self? How do we build that confidence quotient? How are we complete human? So it's very interesting that this gentleman, William Deresiewicz, is talking about how we are creating a generation of excellent sheep. You know, they all seem to be moving in the same direction, aiming for the same kind of jobs or profile building, you know. So that needs to stop somewhere. We need to make education holistic. It should be education should reinvigorate the self. It should be a self discovery. It should be your critical thinking should always be active. You're mentally agile, intellectually very sharp. You need to do all this, and at a humane, while maintaining the humane characteristics, you know, where we have time for our other fraternity, where we have some compassion for the world over. Can we contribute to the society in as positive way as possible, unmindful of probably a terrorist around? Are you able to change that person by your, may not succeed, but I think we need to keep going in the direction of goodness. I think that is very important. And that is where I thought that you know, when you look at the Indian knowledge system, the entire uh, system seems to be about the individual, about the self. So how self acquires prominence over other things, you know, without making the self-centered. I think this, it has been the success story, and that is how we need to move forward. Because if we look at our youngsters, around 30% in 2010, there was a survey in American universities, and they found 30% of the students suffer from depression. You know, I don't know the current statistical data. I'm sure it must have gone up. I'll be happy if it has gone down. But I think, again, the demands that we put on our students at a higher education level, because all the engineers, most of them are in US, not in India. Once they complete their engineering, everybody aims to go abroad. We don't know with the American laws now, with you know, what would happen to our engineers. Would they come back? Would they be here to deliver to its own nation? Would our nation encourage, does our education system encourage them to innovate, to find new discoveries? That's something that we need to look at. So as we move further into the Indian education system, you know, we find that the reflective sciences were very important for our Indian knowledge system. The problem solving was very important. A sense of aesthetics, building your aesthetic perceptions, you know, were very, very important. Creativity was very important. Positive approach was very important while they were trained in defense services. You know, defense studies was important, be it in Takshashila or Nalanda, apart from spirituality. So, you know, how do you defend yourself? How do you make your nation strong from within? That's also very important. So it's not just about self-realizing, not just about the individual. So we start from the individual, move towards the nation. So that's something that is very, very important, I think. So the idea is that education today should innovate, should adapt, should absorb. You know, and I would put it absorb probably the other way around. Absorb, adapt, and innovate. Because if you see what's happening around, because we need to change our gaze as per the times. We need to change the gaze as per the current scenario of the world, and need to redraft everything. So absorb, adapt, innovate, change, and bring about effective ways of moving forward. So compassion also should be part of education. Happiness, caring, being kind, this is also very important. Homo sapiens, Harari is very, very popular with most of the academics, you know. But there was one young faculty in US again, his name is a Dutch historian called Rutger Bregman, just 32. Some of you are there or younger or probably around. He wrote 4 books of those utopia for realists and humankind. He's saying that, and he's proposing that man is basically good. And his premise is built on that. So he says that you build on goodness rather than talking about so much violence and negativity. And unless we learn to appreciate, we will not be able to change the world. So probably a thought for education is to think, how do we redraft, move away from the negative to the positive? So that's another thing. So education to build character, provide ethical moorings, rational scientific temperament, to bring about a change in generation, caring and compassionate generation. This is very important. Now, the other aim of education should be that we keep innovating, we keep advancing scientifically. And how do we overcome that? Because science cannot be put in silos. That is where the education system talks about, research, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary approach. Now, India, the funding pattern in India for education, or let me put it for research per se, is 0.69%. Hardly anything. If we want moonshot research in new dimensions of Indian ethos or building a scientific temperament, because after Aryabhat and Brahmagupta and the ancient knowledge leaders who have brought in remarkable changes, what is that one discovery that India has made, which we are proud of? You have to, look around. You have to search your mind. You have to research, and you will not find, because we have not been able to make drastic changes, big changes. Our Indian scientists who have gone abroad, thanks to the research finding, thanks to the state-of-the-art labs, they have been able to. So our Nobel laureates in science, they've been able to do something because of the funding that's been provided. So I think NEP, which is so very well drafted. Now, I generally say proof of the pudding is in eating. How do we actualize it? It should not be restricted to the papers. Policies very often are forgotten. They're there, they're discussed probably in 1 or 2 forays, but you find that it's not implemented very often. So you have to make it implementable. Now that depends on the leadership. How do we do it? Now take a look at research. That's one. Funding has to increase. How many universities, I'm not talking about IITs, probably are still doing better than universities, but IITs primarily are for the engineering graduates. how many central universities or how many state universities or how many deemed universities have recasted their labs? And when was the last time they have done it? You know, so we need to look at our, unless infrastructure is provided. You know, infrastructure to me, according to me, is the most important parameter of any education system. Unless you prepare the locale, the infrastructure, provide you cannot enthuse the faculty. They're restricted to their courses and classroom teaching, and once in a while publishing a paper. You know, some universities still, I remember when I started my career very young, I used to take 24 classes per week. How did I do that? I'm not able to gauge that now. I cannot understand how, but it could. At 5:30 last hour, you step out of the class, you're still fresh. Because remember, knowledge adds vibrancy to your personality. It enthuses you, it adds that zest into you. So as you move from one class to another, your energy does not deplete if the scholarship is strong, you know. So that's something that we need to do, and that can be done through building a research profile. So institutions should focus. How many universities in India have humanities labs? We don't have. You go to Yale, they have a lab for humanities. Social sciences, you know, when we talk about humanity labs, very often people ask, you're a professor of English? Yes, I am. I do teach English literature, culture, Indian literature, but labs are not just language labs. You need to have other labs too, where you can look at material. How has literature evolved? How have civilizations evolved? How have cultures grown? You know, all this is something that you do it in humanities. How is it that we know more about Western philosophy than Indian philosophy? You know, most of us don't know much about Indian philosophies. So the time to have labs for humanities, for social sciences, apart from science laboratories, you must have a special laboratory for climate sciences. You know, one must create laboratories for every segment of knowledge. Unless we learn to do that, I don't think we can move forward. The second important thing that we need to is somebody keeping track of time? Internationalization. You know, this is something very important. The legislative frameworks of the institutions must change. You know, our regulations were such that universities do not have freedom to, we do have MOUs trapped in those files. Not very effective. I'm not talking about one or two top universities who have been able to bring about effective changes, but universities across India should be able to have, joint degrees. You know, that's the most ideal thing. When I was in Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute, I held one education summit, which I focused on, why is it not possible for India to tie up with other institutions of merit and carve joint degrees? This will help our students. This will help our younger generation. This will help in knowledge creation, because ultimate aim of education is knowledge creation. We are changing the knowledge landscape. You know, while self-realization, Atmanaviddhi, building a self, that's the beginning. But it needs to move towards creating new knowledge. So creation of new knowledge would mean that you're as collaborative as you can get. And that can happen only when we tie up with institutions. So joint degrees, CoTUTEL, you know, where my faculty are able to teach abroad. We have faculty coming from there, joint teaching. I'm not saying you're just going there, and we do that very often. Most of us have done that. But has there been a joint teaching? Did a school come together? Did a department come together and say that these are the 2 faculty members who will be teaching this program jointly? That's co-tutor. So it has to be joint teaching. So this kind of a thing, joint research, again, a very important, do we have projects that we work together on? Yes, we do have, but maybe the number is very small. So we need to identify projects that will make an impact in the global scenario, bring about effective changes in society. Our standards of living are notched up. So project be realistically based. Of course, we do need philosophical projects as well, but philosophy is always prompt us to move in a certain direction. So is that a direction that will help humanity? Something that we need to posit on new projects or new research areas. And this can be done better with collaborations. We need to learn to come together. So study abroad programs, do we send our PhD students for 1 semester abroad? I did that in my earlier institution. We need to, some universities I know do it, but it should be across so that we are able to look at a lot of things in a different way. Now, I was also looking at, I'll come to the 2 more things that I wanted to posit on. But, the new education system, notwithstanding the pandemic, blended teaching, the virtual mode of teaching, all these have started about a decade back, if I'm correct, abroad, or a little earlier than that. But, resulting in a lot of content developing platforms. Coursera is very, very popular. They tie up with Google, they tie up with top Microsoft, top corporate companies, and they create content. So content creation. This is something that we need to tie up and see how our university, Udacity is one, Udemy is, these are 3 platforms that are doing exceedingly well. When you travel abroad and look at all these, I feel we are 30 years behind time probably. So we need to look at that. Then you have the University of California has started something which is called Next Generation Undergraduate Success Measurement Project. It's a project, but the project is called Next Generation Undergraduate Success Measurement. The focus is on undergraduates. What would be the success measurement for the next generation? What would you call success? This again, they're tying up with different universities to do that. This is a project that is funded by Andrew Mellon Foundation. This is a very important thing. How do we get funding from different bodies for individual research projects, call it moonshot or not, but you just have to think afresh, think anew. NEP provides us that platform. I'm talking about how do we implement. So my talk today was focusing on implementation and some of the ways to do it. The other important thing that I found was University Innovation Alliance. It's again, there are 11 universities in US who've tied up with each other, and working on university innovation. So it's again creating small projects in how do we innovate, how do we build platforms for innovation, how do we build courses that will enthuse, and how do we, Stanford does not need brand building. We know that it has a huge brand building. But every couple of years, they get an assessment done about their own courses. There was a Galloway assessment some time back, but one of the thing in one of the assessment of the university said that the younger generation, if we look at, if we build their creative quotient and not just building credits, um, they are well attuned to taking greater risks, more fearless, to deal with the problems of the world. So give them opportunities to craft better solutions for our problems. So create a new generation, give them opportunities, to craft better solutions. What would be your solution to a problem like this? So do we have a debate on that? Just a project on that? So things like that. This is very important, I thought, because university systems need to work on goals. So how do we set our goals? One of the things that I generally get little perturbed with is that our faculty or academic world, we find comfort zones wherever we are. And then we don't want to get out of that comfort zone. One of the first principles that I have worked in life is, personally I'm talking, the moment I get comfortable in a chair, it's time to leave that chair. You need to find newer challenges and find newer solutions to that. So unless we learn to take risks, we cannot move forward. So this is very important, that how do we train our younger generation? So also seeking funding. If you have projects like this and you are able to publicize about it, probably we will get private funding. There will be foundations, there will be Tata set an example right at the beginning, funding education. I'm sure there'll be many more people coming forward to fund Indian education. You find all the corporate people seem to be funding institutions abroad or individuals abroad. I think we need to work in that direction. That's very important. Now, the other thing I thought that multidisciplinary education that NEP talks about, this is again a very interesting platform, apart from, of course, exit routes that has been created in your 4-year degree platform. First year with certificate, second year with diploma, third year with a bachelor's degree, fourth year with a composite degree that you get, and MA first year courses, final year research. So I was talking about research by and large. When we come to multidisciplinary approach, why can't somebody do chemistry with music and philosophy? For example, I'm a random example I'm thinking about. You pursue. Now, I firmly believe, and I did this in my earlier institution, your cafeteria model gives you the autonomy, the faculty, the autonomy to draft their courses. And even at Nalanda, I review the courses. Anything that is very innovative, out of the box, I promote immediately. This is something. So we are not going by the same courses that were taught when we were children. I'm talking about my generation. So we need to look at new courses. So a student in a cafeteria model, it's like you have the menu wide ranging, you pick and choose. So a student has the freedom to carve his own degree. What kind of a degree will emerge is something that the student will decide based on his choices. So choice is very important. So giving the student the freedom to choose, thereby developing his critical thinking. And I'm coming to that. In multidisciplinary scenario, be it in Nalanda that I see, There were courses on astronomy, on astrology, Vastu Shastra, defense studies, spiritualism. You had tantric yoga, tantra philosophy. You could do across, you know, and all through Guru Shishya, the monastic thing that we've had for India has a continual system of knowledge creation and ancient knowledge tradition. Aurobindo called our Indian knowledge tradition, compared it to Ganga. It flows like Ganga forever. There's no stopping it. So 5 millennia and we're still moving forward. But I think time to take another look and not just take pride in what we were. Very often we look behind our back and take great pride in our ancient knowledge systems. And my concern is, what about future? What have we done in the recent past? What can we do? So you come to, if they had at that time, why can't we do it now? So the NEP also speaks about multidisciplinary way of moving forward. So in this context, you know, the celebrated novelist C.P. Snow said something, you know, he gave a lecture in Cambridge University, and I'm talking about 1959, not in the recent past. And the lecture was titled The Two Cultures and the Scientific Revolution. And he said the two cultures are two polarities. These are two different, and that is sciences and humanities. These are the two cultures. And there's a huge division between the two. These are the two different cultures. We need a scientific revolution to bring it all together. You know, how do we study, you know, science, have the scientific temperament, even when you're doing humanities or social sciences? How do we bridge the gap between the two? So he was talking about how the society, the academic society is split into two cultures of science and humanities, which is a major hindrance to solving world's problems, he said. You know, I think finally an education policy looking at multidisciplinarity, I think huge success there. You know, we are given a bandwidth for us to explore. The gamut is in front of us. It's up to youngsters that I see here, how you carve your own roadmap. That's so. What happens with the multidiscipline? I was looking at, apart from building bridges, bringing about progress in human knowledge to benefit the society or the world. You know, some of the things, you know, I was thinking, what can it give to the younger generation? What can the faculty teach through this? What are so one I thought is transferable skills again. You know, the ability to move with ease in different disciplines. That's one. I thought two is it gives you critical thinking, where you're looking across boundaries of disciplines. Apart from moving smoothly, you're looking across, positing, analyzing. So that critical thinking. Then you have self-management. It also teaches you, why do I say this? I was thinking about it and I thought this is very important, because we need to understand that it identifies, the student identifies one's own priorities, managing choices. I spoke about choices a while back. So what choices do you make? That's again very important. Then problem solving, that it teaches you that skill as well. And it brings flexibility. I generally, to me, flexibility is the most important thing. Dynamics of education, dynamics of a faculty, of a teacher, you know, knowledge system itself. Because if you're not mentally agile and flexible, ability to move with ease, you know, that's you have to adapt to different contexts, reinvent. All this is something that will bring into foreplay. Then I think lastly, the synthesis of ideas. How do you synthesize different ideas, different philosophies? How do you look at different systems? Thomas Hobbes spoke about institutions are important because that will discipline an individual. That's what he said. Whereas Rousseau held that man is trapped in all these institutional chains, doesn't give freedom enough. So if you look at just a summary of the philosophy, so you need to find a middle path where things are. So that I think that's very important, and multidisciplinary education is able to do that. Now, I think we have a time for some discussion. So I will end by quoting T.S. Eliot here. He said something very significant. He said, where is life that we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? And where is knowledge we have lost in information? So finally, we are a world trapped or surrounded by too much information. Click of a mouse, you have everything, all information. Now, do we have the ability to sieve through, filter the information? Do we apply knowledge to cull out the wisdom out of it? Do we make a living that's worth calling a life? So what is it? What are we? Where are we today? Because as intellectuals, because we are also, as academics, we are shaping the intellect, constantly shaping and reshaping the intellect, not just of our students, but ourselves as well. So that's where I think grounding is very important. Discretion is an art. How we sieve through, it's separating the chaff from the grain. Very, very important. So these are the things I thought, and you cannot dwell on the entire proposition of NEP, but I was looking at what can we do, or can we just get into a lamenting mode and say we are not good? And I don't think we should ever say that, because if anything, I believe firmly that India suffers from lack of confidence and self-worth. If we are able to build self-worth, we stop lamenting and we get on to positive terrain to build a new architect of education. So NEP is only a platform. It gives us, and how do we as leaders, and I do believe in the regulation or the education leaders have to be as innovative as they can get. Give the autonomy to the faculty to create new courses within the discipline, looking at the world, 30 years from now. Would that knowledge be applicable, relevant? Or once the students leave the portals of the college or the university, immensely forgettable knowledge, then it's not knowledge. It was only information. So I think these are things which are essential to posit upon. And that is where I thought that we now have been provided with a new platform thanks to our government. A new trajectory now needs to be carved, and this needs to be done by every individual in the knowledge domain. If we call ourselves leaders of knowledge or belonging to knowledge spectrum, then I think imagination has to be vibrant as it can get. So thank you for the attention. I think I'll be more happy to take any there's a Q&A, right?
Yes, ma'am. We'll have a short Q&A.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have a short Q&A. Yeah. Thank you very much, ma'am. I think this was, I mean, really very comprehensive, top class, again, very thought provoking. And obviously, we all could sense that it was, I mean, it really came out from your heart. Exactly why it was such a passionate, I mean, truly a master class. And again, a very broad overview, you know, of the NEP, of the the challenges posed to higher education in India. I think you started out beautifully talking about what really is at the heart of progress in terms of educational institutions or academic learning. It is really about autonomy, autonomy of institutions, autonomy of education leaders, and at some level, even autonomy for students. So that they can really pick and choose what you talked about, the cafeteria approach. I think that is brilliant. And another very important point which you talked about, obviously, that how NAP was really giving a new template where you really talked about reskilling, collaborative research, and again, very important aspect which, and again, that is where the Indian knowledge systems come into play, is about character building, about self-realization. I think that's a very important point you have made. Obviously, then talking about absorption, adapt, innovate, uh, and also pointing out that the central challenge that despite this grand announcement of the NEP now in place, so the real crux or the real the juice would really come in terms of implementation. How are different universities, for example, in Nalanda, I'm sitting in JNU, so how JNU is really putting that into play. I think that is very important point which you pointed out. Ma'am, I'm very happy to share with you and with the other participants that when you talk about collaboration, which is such an important, and I wish it is so important. I mean, in SIS, I'm in School of International Studies. You rightly pointed out, we rarely see, forget joint teaching, even not even joint programs. I don't see, for example, diplomatic studies doing a collaborative event with my sister center, for example, Center for European Studies. Why isn't that not happening? This is so crazy. If it can, this is the least we can do sitting in our own, I mean, departments. Unfortunately, even that is not happening. But I would like to share that we have, I mean, the Indian Futures in its own small ways has had collaborations with JNU. We have had with FICCI, we did an event on Atmanirbhar Bharat with FICCI. We also did with the Temple University of Japan on energy. So we are, and in fact, these were some of the areas which you also pointed out in your presentation. So this was brilliant, ma'am. Thank you so much.